I think it's finally time I write this down. This haunted me for years, but maybe putting it on paper will help me move on. I don't know if I'll ever forgive myself for what happened that night. I was 15. My girlfriend, her brother, my best friend, and I came up with the brilliant idea of staying out all night on Halloween. We had the perfect plan. My friend Art, not his real name, and I would tell our parents we were spending the night at Layla and Will's, not their real names, house. Likewise, Layla would tell her parents that she and Will were spending the night at mine. It was dumb, I know, but we were confident it would work. I wish it hadn't. That Halloween night, we set out, feeling like total rebels. We decided on a group costume, each of us dressed as a DC superhero. Will was Superman, Art was the Flash, Layla was Supergirl, and I was Batgirl. We were pumped, with the whole night ahead of us to stuff our faces with candy and hang out. After about 3 hours of trick-or-treating, people started shutting their doors. By midnight, the entire neighborhood was dark. No lights, no open doors, just silence, except for a barking dog in the distance. Layla and I were getting bored, and I suggested going home. Will refused. You're at a sleepover at my house, remember? And I'm supposedly at yours. You want to be the one to admit you lied to your mom. Come on, Will, Art said, rubbing his stomach, clearly regretting all the candy he'd eaten. This isn't as fun as you said it'd be. Let's just go home. Tell the truth. They'll be mad, but we could still have an actual sleepover. Will looked at us, realizing he was the only one who wanted to stay out. He sighed and seemed ready to give in. Then, his face lit up as he looked behind us. "What's that?" he said excitedly, already moving towards it. I turned around. Not 20 feet away was a house I'd never seen before on our street. It was a typical townhouse, but covered in terrifying Halloween decorations. Not the cheap plastic kind, but the kind that would give kids nightmares. 2 pumpkin-headed scarecrows guarded the front gate, and over 24 skeletons stood at attention in the yard. Jack-o'-lanterns dotted the porch, their faces twisted in agony. A gigantic spider perched in the window looked ready to devour the shrub beneath it, and bones were scattered across the roof. An eerie purple spotlight illuminated the whole house. Layla and I exchanged confused glances. How had we not noticed this before? We'd been all over town, but hadn't seen this glowing purple house. It seemed impossible. I turned to ask Art, but he and Will were already running towards it. Layla shrugged as if to say, "What did you expect?" Reluctantly, we followed. Up close, the house was even more disturbing. The scarecrows stank like rotting pumpkins, and the skeletons looked so real I felt uneasy. I gripped Layla's hand tighter as we passed them. Will rang the doorbell, which sounded like a church bell echoing through the house. "Trick or treat!" we shouted, though Layla's grip on my hand said she was just as freaked out as I was. The door swung open, revealing a woman who looked like she'd stepped out of an old gangster movie. She was tall, with thick copper hair, black eyeliner, and blood-red lipstick, wearing a revealing witch costume. Her eyes lit up when she saw the boys. My 2 handsome heroes at my door," she giggled, her voice sickly sweet. Art smiled and thanked her, while Will just stared. I stepped closer to Layla, feeling uneasy. The woman noticed us but barely acknowledged our presence. She held out a bowl of candy, slowly extending it to me. "Candy, Batgirl?" I took a step back, pulling Layla with me. "No thanks, we've eaten too much candy already." It was true, we'd been gorging ourselves all night. The woman's smile faltered slightly, her cloudy eyes blinking in surprise. She turned to the boys, offering them candy. Will took a full handful while Art only took 2, clearly still battling a stomachache. I glanced at the candy. It wasn't wrapped and didn't look like anything I recognized. The pieces were lumpy and misshapen. When the boys were done, the woman smiled wider. "You must be thirsty. Why don't you come in for some apple cider?" She gestured toward the dark, gaping doorway. Layla visibly recoiled. There was no way we were stepping inside. I forced a smile. "No, thank you." We turned to leave, but then I realized something. Layla and I were alone. Will and Art had disappeared, and so had the woman. My heart pounded in my chest. They went inside. I felt sick. Should we call the police? What would we say? That a pretty lady with spooky decorations lured 2 boys into her house with apple cider. No one would believe us, especially not 2 teenagers out past midnight on Halloween. We had to make sure they were okay. We circled the house, but all the windows and doors were covered, except for the show window. I, dressed in black, would peek inside while Layla kept watch. I crouched near the window, glancing at the plastic spider before peering in. The room inside was dimly lit by a fireplace. 2 large armchairs flanked the fire, and in those chairs were Will and Art, slumped over as if asleep. The coffee table between them held 2 half-empty glasses of cider. In the center of the room stood the woman. She was standing unnaturally straight, her arms limp at her sides. Then, without warning, one arm shot up. She held it there for a moment before letting it fall. A second later, she did the same with the other arm. Then she began to growl. Will and Art rose from their chairs, their eyes closed. The woman placed a finger on each of their foreheads and began chanting. Venenum sanitatum. Age, pure.
Langurem sanitas.
Nescio quomodo lantinum loci. Ut allegent. All 3 of them started convulsing. Art fell first, followed by Will. Their limbs flailed wildly, but gradually weakened until they stopped altogether. I must have made a noise because the woman turned toward me. Her eyes were completely blue, no pupils in sight. Her mouth hung open, blue saliva dripping from her lips, and her face was melting. I screamed. Layla screamed. I pushed myself away from the window, landing hard on my back. Layla yanked me to my feet, and we ran. We crashed through the skeletons, and as we fled, I knocked over one of the scarecrows. Its head smashed, revealing a human skull beneath the pumpkin. We kept running until we reached my house, collapsing on the front lawn in tears. I told my mom everything. At first, she thought I was lying to cover up our sneaking out, but one look at our faces and she called the cops. When they investigated the house, they found it belonged to a Miss Smith, who had been on vacation in Alabama for 2 days. There was no trace of Will or Art. They were never found. The police believe a child predator drugged them and took off, but I know what I saw. Layla and I broke up in 12th grade after her family moved for a fresh start. We still text occasionally, but we're not as close anymore. I've saved her number all these years, though, because tonight, I saw something that brought back that horrible Halloween. A townhouse, bathed in purple light, with skeletons guarding the gate. One was dressed as Superman. The other was dressed as the Flash. When I was growing up, my mom would always get anxious around Halloween. Every year, it would start with the news stories that seemed to roll out on October 1st. Local police would be on the TV, warning parents to check every piece of candy their children got. They'd caution everyone to look out for razor blades in apples or powdered bleach in the Pop Rocks. Like those were the things that killed kids, not guns, cars, or poverty. But my mom was always looking for a reason to be afraid. She didn't like us riding our bikes past the end of the street because she feared a stranger might come along. Every night, she'd check every door and window twice, and then she'd check every closet in the house. Twice. She even called the police on the telephone repairman, just because he was hanging around the pole in our back lane. So, every October came as a kind of relief to her because it gave her an excuse to let her worst fears run wild. The local police and the news told her, "Asterisk, you're right. It's scary out there. Be afraid." Asterisk. I say always, but really I just remember those last few years when things got really bad. Dad says it started small and got worse as she became more religious. The year I was 9, we came back from trick-or-treating to find my mom sitting on the couch, her eyes red, her face streaked with tears. She had clearly been crying the entire time we were gone. She made my sister and me put down our bags of candy, and we weren't allowed to touch any of it until she had examined each piece. She took forever, scrutinizing the wrappers under a bright light with Grandma's crossword magnifying glass. She wasn't done until long after we'd gone to bed, probably around 3 a.m. When we woke the next morning, half our candy was in the garbage because it hadn't passed inspection. I was furious. I pulled some of mine out of the trash, And when my mom found out, she screamed at me, cried, and tried to ground me. My dad had a talk with her afterward, and I wasn't grounded, but he apologized and threw the candy back in the trash. He promised to buy me more, and he did. But store-bought candy never tastes the same as the candy you earn on Halloween. The next year, when I was 10, things got even worse. My mom didn't want us to go trick-or-treating at all. She had seen something on the news. Satanists were drugging children through Halloween candy. My dad sent us outside to play, but we could hear them arguing inside. Her raised voice, the sound of her crying, and my dad's low, calm voice slowly rising to match hers. They fought for 3 hours. My sister and I sat out back, wearing our costumes, watching the day fade away. My sister kept whispering, "We're missing Halloween," as she cried quietly beside me. Finally, the back door slammed open, and my dad stormed out. There was a red mark on his cheek, and his jaw was clenched. When he saw us sitting there, his eyes filled with angry tears. He flung his arms out toward us and said, "Come on, kids, we're going trick-or-treating." We each took one of his hands, and he walked us around the house. When we got out front, my mom stood at the door, shouting, "What are you doing? Frank, you're going to get them killed." My dad, calm as ever, said, "I'm taking the kids trick-or-treating, Linda." She ran out of the house after us, reaching for my sister and me, but we hid behind our dad, who spread his arms protectively to either side. "You don't want to stay?" she cried. "You don't want to stay with Mommy?" But her red face, her wide, wild, shining eyes, they scared us more than anything. We shook our heads and clung to Dad's jacket. At this, she crumpled to the pavement. "You don't love me," she said, voice breaking. "You don't love me. You don't know what you're doing." Dad just put his arms around us and steered us away. "We'll be back at 8, he said over his shoulder. As we reached the end of the block, he apologized. "I'm sorry about your mother, kids. She's going through a really tough time right now, and I don't know how to help her. Is she going to be okay?" my sister asked. Dad put his arm around her and said softly, "Yes, honey, it's all going to be okay." She believed him. She was young enough to believe him, but I wasn't. I was just old enough to hear the doubt in his voice. Still, it was Halloween and we were kids. Before long, we were laughing and running up to houses, trying to be cute, scary, or silly, whatever got us the most candy. Each time we ran back to the sidewalk, our dad stood there with a big, sad smile, telling us how great we were doing. By the end of the night, our pillowcases were full, and my sister had fallen asleep, cradled in my dad's arm. When we got home, I was scared Mom would still be lying in the driveway, but she wasn't. She'd gone to her room and left us alone. We sat in the living room, counting our candy, and Dad let us each have 2 pieces before sending us to bed. But I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mom's face, streaked with tears, her wide, terrified eyes, and the bright black rings of her wet eyelashes. I pulled the covers over my head and cried for a long, long time. Eventually, I ran out of tears, and a numb calm settled over me. I lay there for a while, staring at the patterns on the popcorn ceiling. After a while, I got hungry. Crying always left me feeling hollow, and now I wanted something sweet, something that would remind me of happiness. I had a whole bag of Halloween candy waiting in the living room, so I got up quietly. I opened my bedroom door and tiptoed down the carpeted hallway. The moonlight through the skylight gave just enough light to see. As I neared the living room, I heard a faint rustle. My first thought was that a burglar had come to steal our candy. But when I peeked around the corner, I saw my mom, hunched on the couch, wrapped in blankets. Her hair was wild, and though she wasn't crying, her shoulders trembled with suppressed sobs. Despite her shaky breaths, she was focused, hunched over something in her hands. Her movements were deliberate, careful. My sister's trick-or-treat bag lay on the coffee table. Mom had taken out one of the full-size chocolate bars we got from the rich house down the street. She had unwrapped it. Beside her on the couch were a bowl of ice water and a kitchen towel. She was using them to keep her fingers cold as she worked on the chocolate bar. I wasn't sure what she was doing until something shiny caught the moonlight. a razor blade. In stunned silence, I watched her slowly, methodically slide the blade into the soft chocolate and nougat, hiding it until it was barely visible. Then, with a dab of glue, she resealed the wrapper, making it look almost untouched. She reached for my bag of candy next, drawing another razor blade from the pack beside her. I took a shaky step forward. "Mom!" I'll never forget how her bright eyes glistened in the dark. I'm working at one of those haunted mazes for the month of October. It's a corn maze / haunted house combination, and I'm the girl who works the picture counter. You see, the maze takes a picture of you when you go through a certain part of it, and then at the end you can buy a copy for $5. I don't get to wear a mask and scare people, but it's fun watching everyone's faces. There are always hilarious ones of people screaming or jumping. I've been doing this for a few weeks, and up until Friday night, everyone reacted the same way. People are always scared. That changed around 8:30 p.m. when a picture came through for a party of one. The man in the photo was dressed entirely in black, wearing a jet black bowler hat. But what was strange, he wasn't scared. Not cringing, not jumping. He was staring straight at the camera, his face partially in shadow. It unsettled me because I'd never seen anyone react like that. Ever. But I figured maybe he was prepared for it or just didn't scare easily. I printed the picture, set it aside, and waited for him to come by and buy it. By the end of the night, though, he never showed up to claim his photo. He had to pass my kiosk to exit the maze, so it didn't make sense. Still, I brushed it off, went home, and tried to forget about it. Saturday night, around the same time, 8:30, the same thing happened. Another party of one photo. The man in black. This time, I could see more of his face, and he was smiling, showing nearly all his teeth. The smile was eerie, unsettling. I felt sick, and as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. Just like the night before, the man never came by to buy his picture. By the end of the night, I told my boss about it. I showed him both photos and told him the guy never came to claim them. He dismissed it, saying it was probably a practical joke, just someone trying to freak us out. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next day, Sunday, I went back to work, still on edge. I asked my boss if someone could work with me because I was nervous, but we were short-staffed. He promised to check on me every hour, but I told him it was fine. Early in the night, with the sun still out, I felt okay. Around 7:45, I needed to use the bathroom. I texted my boss to ask for someone to cover me, but he didn't respond for nearly 40 minutes. When he finally replied, he sent the girl from the ticket counter, who I'll call Alex, to cover my spot. I rushed to the bathrooms, just some nasty porta potties, and as I waited in line, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. I looked to my left, and there, standing in the cornfield, was the man in black. That same sinister smile on his face. I froze. No one else was around, and I felt utterly alone. My blood ran cold, and I practically jumped into the porta potty, locking myself inside. I started shaking, crying, and eventually threw up. I stayed in there for 15 minutes, too terrified to come out. When I finally left, I forced myself not to look at the cornfield as I walked back. Alex could tell something was wrong and texted our boss, but he couldn't leave the ticket counter. I told her I was fine, stupidly trying to downplay how scared I was, and sent her back to her post. It was almost 9 p.m. when I decided to check the photos from around 8:30. There was no picture of the man. I wondered if he had known I wasn't at the kiosk and was waiting for me somewhere else, like by the bathrooms. I couldn't understand what I had done to make him come after me. I barely slept that night and decided on Tuesday to quit. I showed up around 5 p.m., hoping to catch my boss when it was still light out. When I knocked on the door of the office, I found him sitting at his desk, staring out the window that faced the cornfield. I called out to him, and when he turned to look at me, his eyes were black, completely black. I gasped and stepped back, my heart racing. Just then, Alex appeared in the doorway, asking if everything was okay. My boss's eyes were back to their usual blue, and he smiled like nothing had happened. He asked me if I needed something, but I could barely speak. I stammered a response, and he told me to wait while he went to check a camera in the maze that wasn't working. He suggested I go to the photo kiosk and wait to see if the camera would take a picture. Still shaken, I agreed. I booted up the computer and waited. To pass the time, I looked through old photos. That's when I noticed something strange. All the pictures from Friday and Saturday between 8:26 and 8:32 were missing. Deleted. I got chills. Just then, my phone buzzed with a text from my boss. It read, "Now." I checked the camera feed, nothing. I texted back that it wasn't working. His reply came instantly. "Check now." There was a new picture. I clicked on it and there he was. The man in black, his head tilted to the side, sneering. I gasped, stumbled backward, and tripped over the computer cords. I got up and ran to the maze where the camera was, calling out for my boss and Alex. But no one answered. Something crashed nearby, and I saw a flash of light. Terrified, I ran back outside. Alex and my boss were standing there, asking if the picture had shown up. I didn't know what to say, so I lied, saying it hadn't. My boss patted me on the shoulder, thanked me for helping, and then asked what I had wanted to talk about earlier. I stammered out that I needed to quit, gave some excuse about personal reasons and schoolwork, and left without mentioning the man or the photos. I don't know what's happening, but I'm terrified. Every Halloween, the girl in the mask wants candy, and nobody knows where she comes from. She wears a mask with no face and knocks on our doors, loudly uttering the quintessential Halloween phrase, "Trick or treat," and you've got to hand her candy. If you don't, you die. Nobody knows where she comes from or where she goes. She's always been here, part of the community as long as anyone can remember, and she'll be here long after. There are theories about where she comes from and what she is, but none have ever been proven to be true. There's a fine line between bravery and stupidity. Occasionally, you'll have the daredevil teens or the newbie homeowner who wants to know and tries to follow her. Usually, they come back with their memory erased from the night. Or maybe they speak of something horrible beneath the mask, a face like no other. An image so savage and raw, it was enough to drive the insane sane and the sane insane. A couple of years ago, Danforth David's man moved in. He was a cruel man who would take any opportunity to inflict the most evil things on people. He would call the police on neighbors having a simple drink or kids having fun. That year, the girl in the mask with no face paid us all a visit, as usual. Danforth didn't listen to our warnings about the girl, though it wasn't like we warned him well, if you know what I mean. Danforth lived across the street, and when the girl knocked on my door, screaming, "Trick or treat," I opened the door and saw Danforth across the street, arms crossed, a Bible in his hand. He was grunting menacingly, lecturing passers-by on the demons of Halloween, claiming we were inviting devils into our homes. I handed the girl, who oddly never held a bag, a few packets of candy. She giggled and thanked me, just like any other child. "Hey," I began, pointing at the now screaming Danforth. "I heard that man gives really good candy. You should go over there." "Really?" the girl gasped. If she had a face behind her mask, her eyes would have been wide. "That's awesome." I smiled and nodded. The girl wouldn't kill him, it would take more than a simple refusal to kill. At first, there were stages to the effects of the girl. I watched nervously as the girl in the mask skipped over to my neighbor, an elderly woman who lovingly handed over 6 packets of candy. I'd heard she tried to follow the girl to wherever she came from many years ago and had been terrified of what she saw. The girl thanked her loudly and finally skipped over to Danforth. It was as if the whole neighborhood collectively held its breath. We all knew what happened to those who refused the girl candy. Nothing too life-threatening, but we all wanted Danforth's crimes against the community to be paid for. "Trick or treat," the girl laughed. Even across the street, her voice was joyful and loud. Danforth looked at her, quite puzzled. He'd been loud in his preaching against Halloween and was stunned when the girl completely ignored him and loudly screamed, "Trick or treat," again. "Now listen here, young lady," Danforth began. "Halloween is a creation of evil, and any pure soul must know that. Trick or treat," the girl exclaimed, ignoring Danforth's lecture. When Danforth did nothing but continue, the girl skipped away, happy as before, to the next house over. Danforth started to go back to preaching. After a few lines, he stopped. All eyes were on him now. This wouldn't be something to miss. He began to cough, and immediately we saw it. Blood. The man coughed again, and more blood erupted. And now, not just blood, but needles. He coughed more violently, and more needles sprang from his throat, scratching him and falling to the floor. It lasted about a minute until he stopped, and then he angrily charged forward, running at the girl. Oh no! He grabbed her by the neck, shaking her violently and screaming, "What have you done to me?" Followed by a flurry of curses. The girl didn't respond, only staring up at him with the mask of no face. Danforth shook her more violently and demanded, "What the devil have you done to me? Take that mask off. Young lady, a good girl like." And then he tore off the mask and screamed. I looked away, and so did everyone else who was watching. I looked into my hands and the bowl of candy I was holding. I heard screaming like I had never heard before. Screams that went on until they stopped. I gingerly peered back outside. Danforth was on his knees, a blank look on his face. He stared into the torn-off mask, now held in his hands. He remained silent, unmoving, and then he collapsed. The girl hopped and skipped away. She had collected her fill for the night, and though Danforth had torn her mask away, another had emerged, covering her face as the moonlight shone above. She skipped off into the distance, and as she vanished, we all breathed a sigh of relief. When I first moved here 6 years ago, I thought it was an elaborate prank, a friendly urban legend to spook the kids. I have 2 kids myself. When the girl actually came, I thought it was part of the prank, and fortunately, I gave her candy. After Halloween, I asked who had been the cheerful little girl that aligned perfectly with the legend. To my surprise, everyone stayed true to their story. Some of the older people shared terrible tales about the girl, and gradually, I was left with no choice but to accept that things were just that way. But after I saw what happened to Danforth, I realized it really was true. Danforth regained consciousness the next day. He picked himself up off the street and returned to his house, confused and still terrified. He made himself small and stopped bothering people at first. When Christmas hit, Danforth returned to his old ways, ringing up the cops whenever some poor soul was too loud for his liking or playing music that pissed him off. There wasn't much we could do about him. He was rich and held sway over the local government. As Halloween approached again, Danforth grew more crazed. We thought he'd finally shut up about Halloween and abide by the legend, but no, now he was more vocal against Halloween. And not just him, he had cronies, 2 other Danforth-like copies who echoed anything he said. "We're gonna kill that menace," he shouted, going door to door and handing out flyers that warned against feeding her candy. He claimed we were giving the devil our souls. At last, Halloween rolled around. Trick or treat, I heard, as knocks pounded on the door. I practically leaped over and opened it, seeing the girl once more. The mask with no face was still there, though now there was a thin, almost smile. "Here you go," I cheered, handing her a large grouping of candy. The girl was practically bouncing with joy, though it was clearly not because of the candy. "Why are you so happy today?" I asked. "Today, I get more treats," she replied, jumping up and down. "More treats than I've ever had before. More treats that will bring peace and justice back to our community." Before I could ask what she meant, Danforth and his cronies ambushed her. "You devil!" Danforth shouted, stopping the girl in her tracks. His cronies surrounded her. "I order thee to leave our holy community." One of the cronies began chanting something while the other waved around 2 Bibles. "In the name of all that is good and holy, I banish thee," Danforth growled, reaching for the mask. "I reveal to the Lord the face of a devil. May he destroy you and bring peace to our land." Danforth ripped the mask off, revealing her true identity. A face of nothing, an endless void. But there were shapes that didn't make sense. I didn't see her face in full, just from the sides, and I quickly looked away, fearing the impossible geometric shapes that riddled her face. Danforth's cronies screamed as they saw whatever was in that void. One of them tripped and impossibly flew backward, crashing into Danforth's house. The other froze in place and began to float off the ground, higher and higher, until he was never seen again. Danforth? Whatever happened to him was worse than the others. He began to throw up, but not needles this time. Instead, he vomited packets and packets of empty candy wrappers. The girl picked up her mask and placed it back on her face. Danforth stopped vomiting wrappers and looked back at the girl, who placed her arms on his shoulders and whispered something. Danforth's eyes bulged in horror. Then his eyes became candy wrappers that floated away in the wind. The rest of him followed, exploding into hundreds of black and orange wrappers that drifted away under the moonlight. The girl, happy as ever, skipped into the horizon. It was the best Halloween party I've ever had. It traumatized me for life. It was such an incredible party. If I had to pick out the happiest and most wonderful moments of my life, that Halloween party would have been one of them. That's why it hurts so much to remember it. It makes me want to break down crying whenever I think about the terrible, awful thing that happened right under our noses and how none of us even noticed. It feels so obvious, looking back on it now. Hindsight is 20/20, I suppose. I wouldn't say I'm a particularly unsocial person. I think I get along with people quite well once I've gotten to know them, but something about making that first step of initial contact just always seems so difficult. I always felt incredibly awkward being introduced to strangers, and while I can mask that discomfort fairly well, it does mean that I tend to adopt a slightly stilted and formal attitude when meeting new people. As a consequence, much of my socializing for the past few years has been online. The awkwardness is still there, but it feels less uncomfortable when the people I'm introduced to are just text on a screen. However, this means that most of my friends live far away. A handful live within an hour's drive of me, so we hang out when possible. At least we used to before the party. Nowadays, it just feels wrong. It was during one meetup with 3 friends that we discussed the idea of throwing a big party. We all navigated the same general social circles, and we'd considered inviting down the online friends we'd acquired over the years. I suggested hosting it on Halloween. From there, the discussion turned to themes, since what kind of Halloween party wouldn't have a theme? Jessica suggested a mythology and ancient history theme. She loved legends, myths, and classical literature. We'd had many discussions about Beowulf, the Epic of Gilgamesh, and the romance of the 3 kingdoms. As much as I wanted to indulge her, the others pointed out it might be too niche. The discussion continued. Sadie, Jessica's girlfriend, suggested something themed after horror films. Sadie had recently been on a horror movie kick, encouraged by me, and we had all enjoyed rewatching some classics. It seemed like a solid theme, and Jessica and I were about to agree, but then Jake suggested his idea. In any queer friend group, there's usually one straight friend deemed safe. Jake was that friend. I half expected him to suggest something historical, given his degree in military history, but instead, he proposed a traditional Halloween party, bobbing for apples, carving pumpkins, that sort of thing. We all immediately agreed this was the best idea. Not only did it mean none of the attendees had to adjust their costumes, but also none of us had ever attended such a party. The novelty of something nostalgic yet unfamiliar was perfect. Instantly, we discussed activities, decorations, and whether or not we should get a fog machine. We didn't plan the entire party in one night. We had to figure out who we trusted enough to invite to Jessica's house, send out invitations, and even raise money for plane tickets for some friends. Over the months, what had started as idle discussion became a reality. Each of us contributed an activity. Sadie set up a pumpkin carving table themed after an autopsy. It wasn't strictly traditional, but it fit the theme so well. Jessica acquired an old wooden barrel for bobbing for apples and painted Halloween spooks on the sides. My idea was somewhat silly. I set up a mirror game in the bathroom. I'd heard that staring at your reflection in the dark for long enough could distort the image, so I prepared the room with candles and a chair. Jake decided to set up a game of Dead Man's Brains. You've probably heard of it. Boxes with openings covered by cloth where people feel inside for peeled grapes as eyes or spaghetti for guts. Jake didn't care to stick too closely to the traditional version. He said he'd put his own twist on it. We thought it was a great idea. He even made custom boxes for the occasion, labeled eyes, guts, heart, fingers, and of course, brains. The months until the party turned into weeks, then days until finally, it was the night itself. I arrived early with Sadie to help set up, but Jake was nowhere to be found. We texted him but got no response. Jake was usually the most punctual, so this was strange. We had to start without him. As for costumes, Sadie and Jessica went as Carmilla and Laura from Carmilla, inspired by our recent viewing of Dracula's Daughter. Given Sadie's short stature compared to Jessica, it was amusing to see a Carmilla who needed a step stool to suck her victim's blood. I dressed as Keziah Mason from Lovecraft's Dreams in the Witch House, a Puritan outfit with a ragged shawl and a toy rat. Finally, after everyone else had arrived, Jake showed up. He knocked on Jessica's door, and I answered to see him dressed as a gas-masked infantryman from the Great War. Next to him were wooden boxes for his dead man's brains game. He handed me a note explaining he had lost his voice due to a cold, couldn't find his train card, and his phone was dead. We set up the game together. The rest of the night went perfectly. Everyone laughed, joked, played games, and carved pumpkins. Jake's dead man's brains was a hit. He accepted each compliment with a nod and a tip of his helmet. I couldn't get through all 5 boxes. After the guts, I backed out, laughing at my own squeamishness. The party became a sleepover. As the night wound down, Jake excused himself with a note thanking Jessica for hosting. He left quietly, and we all went to sleep happy, content, and full of joy. In the morning, everything changed. I woke up to a horrible smell. I traced it to the boxes. I put on gloves and reached inside the eyes box. I screamed. The police arrived within 15 minutes. We couldn't give them a description of the suspect. We never saw his face under the gas mask. We didn't even know if it was Jake. The eyes, intestines, severed fingers, heart, and the severed head with the skull neatly removed were taken as evidence. But I imagine Jake's family were swiftly given custody of the remains shortly afterwards. It's not like forensics would be able to get any usable fingerprints off of them, given how many of us had touched them.